The lawyer's office was colder than I expected. I sat in a leather chair near the window, staring at the rain sliding down the glass across from me. Mr. Harris, the family lawyer, carefully arranged several documents on his desk. He had known my parents for more than 20 years, and I had always thought of him as someone I could trust. My parents had died 6 weeks apart. First, my mother passed away unexpectedly. Then, barely a month later, my father followed her after years of struggling with his health. Their deaths had left me exhausted, confused, and emotionally numb. I was their only child. At least that was what I had always believed mattered. My cousin Daniel sat beside me, looking unusually confident. He was my father's sister's son and had always been treated like part of the immediate family growing up. I never resented him. We played together, celebrated holidays together, and shared countless memories. But as Mr. Harris opened the file, I noticed something strange. He avoided looking directly at me before we began. He said quietly, "I want you both to understand that these documents represent your parents' final wishes." I nodded. Daniel leaned forward. "Just read it," he said. Mr. Harris adjusted his glasses and began. My father had left the family house savings, investment accounts, and several properties to Daniel. Everything. I waited for my name. It never came. My mother's will was almost identical. Her jewelry, savings, and personal possessions were also left to Daniel. I stared at the papers for several seconds. Nobody spoke. Then I laughed. It was not because anything was funny. I simply couldn't understand how a person could hear that their own parents had left them nothing and remain completely silent. "Are you saying I get nothing?" I finally asked Mr. Harris lowered his eyes. "According to the wills, yes." Daniel shifted in his chair. "I'm sorry," he said, but there was no sadness in his voice. There was relief. I looked at him. "Did you know?" He hesitated. That hesitation answered everything. "How long?" He said. "Nothing, Mr. Harris interrupted. "There is one more matter." He pulled out another envelope. This was left with instructions that it should be given to you only after the will was read. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single handwritten letter from my father. "My dear child, if you are reading this, then you already know what I have left behind. Please do not judge me too quickly." I stared at those words until they blurred. The letter explained that my parents had intentionally created the appearance that Daniel would inherit everything. But why? The answer was hidden in the next paragraph. My father wrote that over the previous year he had discovered that someone close to the family had been secretly manipulating financial records and transferring money from accounts. He had suspected Daniel, but he had no proof. Instead of confronting him, my father decided to watch carefully. Then he discovered something worse. Daniel had been working with someone inside the family business. Together they had planned to take control of several properties by convincing my parents to sign documents they did not fully understand. My father had realized that if he openly changed the will, Daniel might become suspicious, so he created a trap. The wills were real. Daniel would inherit everything, but only temporarily. A separate legal trust had been established months earlier, containing evidence, financial records, and conditions that would determine who could actually keep the assets. My father had left me one instruction: trust no one until you have read the second file, Mr. Harris pushed another folder toward me. Daniel immediately stood. "What is that?" The lawyer looked at him. "Sit down." For the first time, Daniel looked afraid. Mr. Harris opened the folder. Inside were bank statements, property records, copies of emails, recordings, and photographs. There was enough evidence to show that Daniel had been moving money from my parents' accounts. But the biggest surprise was still waiting. The person helping him was not a stranger. It was my father's trusted financial advisor for years. The advisor had been convincing my father to invest money into companies controlled indirectly by Daniel. The losses had been disguised as market failures. My parents had not been careless. They had been deceived. I looked at Daniel. "You knew they were investigating you." His face had gone pale. "I didn't steal anything, Mr. Harris placed one final document on the table. "You signed this agreement 6 months ago." Daniel stared at it. It was a confession disguised as an inheritance acknowledgement. If he accepted the estate, he agreed to an independent audit of every transaction involving my parents' assets. My father had anticipated everything. Daniel had signed because he believed he had already won. Now his signature was the evidence that could destroy him. The room became completely silent. I expected to feel anger. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Mr. Harris explained that the actual ownership of the estate would be transferred according to the trust conditions. Most of the property would eventually come to me, but only after the legal proceedings were completed. Daniel would not receive the fortune. He would receive something else entirely: lawsuits, investigations, and the consequences of his choices. He looked at me. "You knew?" I shook my head. "No, then why aren't you celebrating?" I looked toward the rain-covered window. "Because my parents had to die before I learned how much they had been protecting me." Those words silenced him. The next few months were difficult. The investigation revealed years of financial manipulation. Daniel eventually admitted enough to avoid a much harsher sentence, but he lost nearly everything he had gained through deception. The advisor was prosecuted separately. As for me, I inherited my parents' home, but I refused to sell it. I kept the old furniture. My mother's books remained on the shelves. My father's favorite chair stayed beside the fireplace. But I did something else. I created a foundation in their names. The money from the estate was used to help families facing financial exploitation and elderly people who had been deceived by relatives or trusted advisors. People ask why I did it. I always gave the same answer: because my parents taught me something even after they were gone. Inheritance is not measured by how much money someone leaves you. Sometimes the greatest inheritance is the truth. And sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is the final move in a plan someone spent years preparing. At that lawyer's office, I thought I had lost everything. I walked in believing my parents had chosen my cousin over me. I walked out realizing they had trusted me with something far more valuable than property. They had trusted me with the truth. And that was why, when Daniel thought he had won everything, I quietly smiled. Because he had inherited the fortune, but I had inherited the evidence.